On the vast plains of Eastern Europe, history has always been written in blood and in the clash of empires. To understand the present war between Russia and Ukraine, one must go back 1,000 years to a time when these lands were the heart of a powerful and luminous civilization. In the 9th century, traders from Scandinavia, known as Varangians, navigated the great rivers of Eastern Europe, linking the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea, and from there to the Byzantine Empire. Along the banks of the Dnieper, one of the richest of these trading hubs grew into the city of Kiev. Around the year 882, the Varangian prince Oleg seized Kiev and made it the capital of a new state, the Kievan Rus. It was here, in the 10th and 11th centuries, that the foundations of Eastern Slavic civilization were laid. The Kievan Rus was not merely a loose confederation of tribes, but a sophisticated polity that drew wealth from trade and from its fertile agricultural lands. In 988, Prince Vladimir the Great accepted Christianity from Byzantium, and the entire people were baptized in the Dnieper. This act bound the Rus firmly into the orbit of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and with it came literacy, architecture, and a worldview that would leave a lasting imprint on both Russians and Ukrainians alike. Kiev's Golden Dome churches became symbols of a thriving civilization, and its rulers married into European dynasties. In the 11th century, under Yaroslav the Wise, the Rus reached the height of their power, codifying laws and fostering a culture that would echo through the centuries. But this golden age did not last. In the 12th century, the Rus state fractured into rival principalities. Kiev declined as competing centers like Novgorod and Vladimir Suzdal grew in influence. The fatal blow came in 1240, when the Mongols swept across the steppe. Under Bata Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongols destroyed Kiev in a brutal assault, leaving it a ruin of ashes and corpses. For the next 2 centuries, much of the Rus lived under the shadow of the Mongol yoke, paying tribute to the Golden Horde. While some cities, such as Novgorod, maintained partial autonomy, the unity of the Kievan Rus was lost forever. From the wreckage of this world emerged 2 distinct trajectories. In the northeast, the Principality of Moscow began to grow under Mongol suzerainty. By allying with their overlords and gradually expanding their control, the Muscovite princes built a power base that would eventually challenge the Mongols and claim the mantle of Rus. In the western lands, however, where the Mongol grasp was weaker, the people who would one day call themselves Ukrainians experienced a different fate. Much of this territory came under the rule of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania during the 14th century. In 1362, at the Battle of Blue Waters, Lithuanian forces defeated the Mongols, and soon Kiev and its surrounding lands fell under Lithuanian protection. Unlike Muscovy, Lithuania was more tolerant of local autonomy, and Ukrainian elites preserved their Orthodox faith and traditions. In 1569, the Union of Lublin created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a powerful state that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Through this union, much of Ukrainian territory was transferred from Lithuanian to Polish control. The Polish nobility, or Szlachta, expanded eastward, establishing vast estates on Ukrainian soil. Polish became the language of the ruling class, and Roman Catholicism spread among the elites. For the peasantry, however, life was harsh. Bound to the land as serfs, many Ukrainians suffered under heavy burdens, while their Orthodox faith was marginalized. The Union of Brest in 1596 attempted to bring the Orthodox Church in the Commonwealth under the authority of Rome, creating the Uniate, or Greek Catholic Church. This compromise deepened religious divisions that persist to this day. Out of these conditions arose the Cossacks, a unique warrior society that lived on the borderlands, or Ukraina, of the steppe. These men, often runaway serfs, adventurers, and outcasts, settled along the Dnieper River and developed a fiercely independent culture. Organized into democratic military communities called hosts, the Cossacks elected their leaders, or hetmans, and raided both Ottoman and Tatar lands to the south. By the 16th century, they had become a formidable force, sometimes serving as mercenaries for the Polish king, at other times rising in rebellion. To the Ukrainian imagination, the Cossacks came to symbolize freedom, defiance, and the dream of autonomy. The 17th century was marked by Cossack uprisings against Polish domination. The most significant came in 1648, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a rebellion that swept across the land. Allied with Crimean Tatars, the Cossacks scored victories against Polish armies, and soon Khmelnytsky sought to build an autonomous Ukrainian state. His uprising triggered what became known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising, a devastating conflict that killed hundreds of thousands, including large numbers of Polish nobles and Jewish communities, who were targeted in massacres. For a brief moment, it seemed Ukraine might carve out independence between its powerful neighbors. But the reality of geopolitics pressed in. Facing renewed Polish offensives, Khmelnytsky turned to the rising power of Muscovy for aid. In 1654, at the Treaty of Pereyaslav, he pledged allegiance to the Tsar in exchange for military protection. This moment is remembered very differently in Russia and Ukraine. To the Russians, it symbolized the reunification of two branches of the Rus people under Moscow's leadership. To many Ukrainians, it was the beginning of a long story of subjugation, one in which Moscow's protection quickly turned into control. The following decades were chaotic as Poland, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire fought for influence over Ukraine. In 1667, the Truce of Andrusovo partitioned Ukrainian lands along the Dnieper. The west went to Poland, the east, including Kiev, to Russia. The once united vision of Cossack autonomy was shattered, and Ukraine was divided between rival empires. The Hetmanate, the semi-autonomous Cossack polity, survived in eastern Ukraine under Russian suzerainty, but its independence was steadily eroded. By the early 18th century, under Peter the Great, Russia was asserting direct authority. When Hetman Ivan Mazepa allied with Sweden against Russia during the Great Northern War, he was crushed at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, ending hopes of an independent Cossack-led Ukraine. Meanwhile, Western Ukraine remained under Polish domination. Here, the Polish nobility expanded estates, while peasants continued to labor under harsh conditions. The Greek Catholic Church persisted as a unique feature of Ukrainian religious life, bridging Orthodoxy and Catholicism, but also becoming a focal point of identity. The borderlands remained volatile, threatened by raids from the Crimean Tatars to the south, who, under Ottoman suzerainty, captured slaves and devastated settlements. Ukrainian history in this era was thus defined by vulnerability caught between great powers, exploited by landlords, and fragmented by divisions. By the mid-18th century, the map of Europe was shifting once more. Russia was rising as a major empire, expanding southward toward the Black Sea. In a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire, Russia gradually broke the power of the Crimean Khanate, annexing Crimea in 1783 under Catherine the Great. At the same time, Poland was in decline. Between 1772 and 1795, Poland was partitioned 3 times by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. In the final partition of 1795, Poland ceased to exist, and most of western Ukraine came under direct Russian control. The remaining western regions, such as Galicia, fell under Austrian rule. By the end of the 18th century, the dream of Ukrainian autonomy had vanished. The Cossack Hetmanate was abolished in 1764, and the Zaporizhian Sich, the Cossack stronghold, was destroyed by Russian troops in 1775. Thus, by 1800, Ukraine had become a land carved up between empires, its people divided by different rulers but united by the memory of lost freedom. In the east and center, Russian imperial control imposed new structures of governance and sought to integrate Ukrainians into a wider Russian identity. In the West, under Austria, a different set of influences took hold, though Ukrainians remained peasants in a stratified society. Yet through all this, the memory of Kiev as the ancient heart of Rus, the legacy of Cossack freedom, and the persistence of Orthodox and Greek Catholic traditions ensured that Ukrainian identity survived. This long era, from the 9th to the 18th century, set the stage for everything that followed. The lands of Ukraine were rich, fertile, and strategically vital. They were also vulnerable, lying open to steppe invasions and imperial ambitions. Under the long shadow of the 18th century, Ukraine entered the 19th with its lands fragmented and absorbed into empires that cared little for its aspirations. After the destruction of the Zaporizhian Sich in 1775, the abolition of the Hetmanate in 1764, and the annexation of Crimea by Catherine II in 1783, Ukraine had ceased to exist as a recognized polity. The partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795 ensured that the right bank region, Galicia, Volhynia, and Bukovina found themselves carved into imperial dominions. The lion's share of Ukrainian lands fell under the authority of the Russian Empire, while the Habsburg monarchy absorbed Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. This division shaped the destinies of Ukrainians for the next century, subjecting them to the competing influences of Tsarist autocracy and Habsburg rule, and creating starkly different cultural and political environments. It is within this context that the 19th century became the crucible of modern Ukrainian national consciousness. In the Russian Empire, Ukrainians were generally referred to as Little Russians, a term implying a subordinate role within a wider, all-Russian nation. The Tsarist state viewed Ukrainian identity as a local dialect and regional variant of Russian, not a distinct nationality. Serfdom, harshly entrenched in Ukraine after being abolished earlier in much of Western Europe, ensured that the peasantry bore the heaviest burdens of exploitation. By 1800, over 80% of the population of right bank and left bank Ukraine remained bound to the land. Social hierarchies were rigid. The nobility often Polonized or Russified, and peasants endured forced labor under landlords' estates. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, affected Ukraine indirectly, as Russian armies drew heavily on Ukrainian recruits and supplies. After the French invasion of Russia in 1812, Ukrainian grain and manpower supported the Tsarist war effort. Yet the outcome of these wars only reinforced autocratic rule, as Tsar Alexander I became a leading figure in the post-Napoleonic settlement. For Ukraine, this meant continued subjugation within a system that denied national expression. A turning point came with the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, led by Russian officers influenced by European liberal ideals. While the uprising failed and its leaders were executed or exiled, some had Ukrainian connections, and the revolt signaled that empire-wide dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface. In the 1830s and 1840s, as European Romanticism emphasized folk culture and national traditions, Ukrainian intellectuals began to rediscover their language, songs, and history. Central to this awakening was the poet Taras Shevchenko. Born a serf in 1814, Shevchenko was freed in 1838 and became a towering figure in Ukrainian culture. His poetry, particularly the collection Kobzar, 1840, celebrated the Cossack past, lamented serfdom, and condemned Russian autocracy. His exile to Central Asia by Tsar Nicholas I in 1847 for participating in the secret Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood illustrates both his influence and the regime's fear of Ukrainian national sentiment. The Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood itself, founded in Kiev in 1845, was a clandestine society of intellectuals advocating for the abolition of serfdom, social equality, and a Slavic federation where Ukraine would be autonomous. Though swiftly suppressed, it represented the first organized articulation of a Ukrainian political vision distinct from Russian imperial identity. Meanwhile, the Habsburg-controlled lands experienced different conditions. In Austrian Galicia, Ukrainians, often called Ruthenians, were subjected to Polish domination within the imperial framework. The nobility remained largely Polish, while Ukrainians were peasants tied to the land. Yet the Austrian state, particularly after the reforms of Joseph II in the late 18th century, allowed greater space for education. And the Greek Catholic Church, which became a key institution preserving Ukrainian identity. Lviv emerged as a cultural center where the Greek Catholic clergy promoted the Ukrainian language, literature, and history. The contrast between the more repressive policies of the Russian Empire and the limited cultural freedoms under the Habsburgs meant that Galicia became a seedbed of Ukrainian nationalism. The revolutionary wave of 1848, known as the Springtime of Nations, reverberated strongly in the Habsburg domains. In Vienna, students and workers demanded liberal reforms, and in Lviv, Ruthenian activists formed the Supreme Ruthenian Council, the first modern Ukrainian political organization. It declared loyalty to the Habsburg Emperor, but demanded recognition of Ukrainians as a distinct nation and called for the division of Galicia into Polish and Ukrainian administrative zones. Though these demands were largely ignored and the revolution suppressed by 1849, the events of 1848 marked the entry of Ukrainians into modern political life. In the Russian Empire, 1848 also brought tremors, though less dramatic. Censorship tightened after the revolutions, and Tsarist authorities sought to curtail any expressions of Ukrainian separateness. The Valuev Circular of 1863 banned the publication of most Ukrainian-language books, claiming that there never was, is not, and cannot be a separate Little Russian language. This was reinforced by the EMSU case of 1876, signed by Tsar Alexander II in the spa town of Bad Ems, which prohibited the printing of Ukrainian literature and the import of Ukrainian publications from abroad. These policies reflected the Russian state's fear of Ukrainian nationalism, even as it tried to bind Ukraine more closely into the imperial structure. The abolition of serfdom in the Russian Empire in 1861 was a landmark event. For Ukrainian peasants, it ended legal bondage but offered little improvement in practice. Freed peasants had to make redemption payments for the land, which was often inadequate and of poor quality. The reforms sparked unrest, as peasants expected real liberation but encountered continued hardship. In contrast, Ukrainian grain exports expanded during the second half of the 19th century, with the fertile black soil of the steppe, particularly in Kherson, Katerinoslav, and Tavria provinces, feeding European markets. This integration into global trade enriched landlords and fueled the growth of cities like Odessa, but peasants remained impoverished. Industrialization also transformed Ukraine in the late 19th century. The Donbas region, rich in coal and iron ore, became a major industrial hub. By the 1890s, cities like Donetsk, then Yuzovka, named after Welsh industrialist John Hughes, who established steelworks there in 1869, and Kryvyi Rih boomed with metallurgical production. Railroads connected Ukrainian cities to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and European markets. Yet this industrial growth came with harsh labor conditions, strikes, and the emergence of a Ukrainian working class alongside Russian and Jewish laborers. National consciousness continued to mature in cultural form. In Kiev, Kharkiv, and Poltava, intellectuals promoted folklore, ethnography, and language studies, often under the guise of academic work to evade censorship. In Galicia, the Shevchenko Scientific Society, founded in Lviv in 1873, became a central institution for Ukrainian scholarship. Ukrainian newspapers, schools, and cooperatives flourished under Habsburg rule, especially after the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 granted greater rights to national minorities, even if Poles still dominated local politics. By the late 19th century, Ukrainian political movements took clearer shape. In Galicia, the National Democratic Party emerged in 1899, advocating for Ukrainian autonomy within Austria-Hungary. In Russian-ruled Ukraine, clandestine political organizations aligned with broader Russian opposition groups, such as the Socialist Revolutionaries and Marxists, though they also articulated distinct Ukrainian concerns. Figures like Mikhailo Drahomanov, an intellectual active in the 1870s and 1880s, argued for federalism, social reform, and Ukrainian autonomy. Exiled to Geneva, Drahomanov spread Ukrainian political ideas abroad and influenced future generations of activists. The dawn of the 20th century brought new challenges. The revolution of 1905 in the Russian Empire shook Tsarist authority and unleashed temporary liberalization. Ukrainian-language newspapers, cultural societies, and political parties briefly flourished. In Kiev, the Prosvita Society promoted education in Ukrainian, and political parties such as the Ukrainian Democratic Party emerged. However, the reactionary policies of Stolypin after 1907 curtailed these freedoms, though they could not entirely suppress the growing tide of nationalism. In Austrian Galicia, politics became increasingly polarized between Ukrainians and Poles. The Ukrainian population demanded greater representation and the establishment of a Ukrainian university in Lviv, which Poles resisted. These tensions sometimes erupted into violence, as in the student demonstrations of 1901 and the bloody clashes of 1910. At the same time, Ukrainian cooperatives, cultural societies, and youth movements like Plast, founded in 1911, fostered a sense of national solidarity. The approach of World War I sharpened these divisions. Ukrainians found themselves caught between two empires whose ambitions clashed. In the Russian Empire, the authorities feared Ukrainian loyalty to Austria-Hungary. By 1917, the Russian Empire was collapsing under the weight of war, revolution, and economic strain. In Ukraine, decades of cultural revival, political agitation, and national awakening had laid the groundwork for a new chapter. When the February Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, Ukrainian activists in Kiev swiftly organized to demand autonomy, leading to the establishment of the Central Rada and the proclamation of the Ukrainian People's Republic later that year. The 19th century had seen Ukrainians move from peasantry bound by serfdom to a people awakening to national consciousness. Their experience under two empires' repressive Russification on one side, limited cultural freedoms under Austria-Hungary on the other prepared them to seize the moment when imperial structures faltered. The century closed, then, not with resolution but with anticipation. The seeds planted by Shevchenko's verses, by the Ruthenian councils of 1848, by clandestine societies and village schools, were ready to germinate. The modern history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, rooted in imperial domination and the denial of Ukrainian self-determination, was already taking shape. The storms of the 20th century would soon break, and Ukraine would once again be a battlefield where empires collided and identities were contested. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 created a political vacuum across Eastern Europe, and Ukraine became one of the most contested spaces in this turbulent reshaping of the region. For centuries, a land ruled by empires, Ukrainians now saw an opening to assert national sovereignty. Yet this opportunity unfolded against the backdrop of global war, revolution, and foreign intervention, ensuring that Ukraine's struggle for statehood between 1917 and 1921 was marked by chaos, shifting alliances, and bloody conflict. The period produced multiple governments, foreign occupations, civil wars, and immense suffering, but it also forged the foundations of the Ukrainian national movement in the 20th century. The February Revolution in Petrograd in March 1917, according to the Western calendar, toppled Tsar Nicholas II and replaced imperial autocracy with the Russian provisional government. News of this seismic change spread quickly to Kiev, where Ukrainian activists, intellectuals, and former political exiles assembled to coordinate a national response. On March 17, 1917, the Central Rada Council was formed, chaired by historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, with Volodymyr Vinnichenko and Simon Petlura among its leading figures. It declared itself the representative body of the Ukrainian people, calling for cultural autonomy and the recognition of Ukraine's right to self-government within a federated Russia. The provisional government in Petrograd, preoccupied with the war effort and internal turmoil, initially recognized the Rada's authority only in cultural matters but rejected political autonomy. Tensions escalated over the summer of 1917, leading the Rada to issue its first universal on June 23, 1917, proclaiming autonomy for Ukraine. When the provisional government refused to recognize this, the Rada escalated with its second universal on July 16, which balanced demands by agreeing to delay full autonomy until the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, but insisted on its right to govern Ukrainian affairs. This uneasy compromise reflected the fragile state of Russian politics on the eve of the Bolshevik seizure of power. The October Revolution of November 1917 transformed the situation dramatically. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government in Petrograd and called for a dictatorship of the proletariat. The Central Rada in Kiev rejected Bolshevik authority, issuing its third universal on November 20, 1917, which proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, as an autonomous entity within a federated Russia. The universal granted civil liberties, abolished the death penalty, and initiated land reforms, resonating with the peasantry. But the Bolsheviks, intent on extending their revolution, saw Ukraine's independence as an existential threat. In December 1917, Bolshevik forces under Vladimir Antonovchenko advanced into Ukraine, capturing Kharkiv and proclaiming a rival Soviet-Ukrainian government there. The Central Rada responded with its fourth universal on January 22, 1918, declaring full independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic. This marked the first modern assertion of Ukrainian statehood, though it immediately plunged the region into war. Bolshevik troops moved on Kiev, and by early February 1918, they captured the city, forcing the Rada to flee. Desperate for support, the Rada turned to the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. On February 9, 1918, the UNR signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, securing recognition of Ukraine's independence in exchange for supplying food to the starving Central European states. German and Austro-Hungarian forces soon entered Ukraine, driving out the Bolsheviks and restoring the Central Rada in Kiev. Yet this support came at a price. The Central Powers quickly imposed their own authority, dissatisfied with the Rada's inability to maintain order or meet grain quotas. In April 1918, with German backing, General Pavlo Skoropadsky staged a coup, dissolving the Central Rada and establishing the Hetmanate, a conservative regime modeled on Cossack traditions but aligned with German interests. Skoropadsky's regime sought to stabilize the country by restoring private property, courting landowners, and suppressing socialist elements. His government founded institutions such as the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, 1918, and Kiev University of Commerce, reflecting a modernizing impulse. Yet his reliance on German military support and his conservative policies alienated large sections of the population, particularly peasants who wanted land redistribution. When Germany and Austria-Hungary collapsed in November 1918 at the end of World War I, Skoropadsky lost his foreign backing. Facing growing opposition, he abdicated on December 14, 1918, and power passed to the Directorate, a coalition led by Simon Petlura and Volodymyr Vinnichenko. The Directorate restored the Ukrainian People's Republic, but it immediately faced overwhelming challenges. The Bolsheviks launched another invasion, retaking Kharkiv in December 1918 and Kiev by February 1919. At the same time, White Russian forces under Anton Denikin, Polish armies seeking to reclaim Galicia, and anarchist bands led by Nestor Makhno in southern Ukraine all vied for control. The UNR found itself squeezed on all sides, lacking the military strength to resist. Meanwhile, in western Ukraine, the collapse of Austria-Hungary in November 1918 allowed Ukrainians in Galicia to declare the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, centered in Lviv. On November 1, 1918, Ukrainian troops seized Lviv in what became known as the November Uprising. However, Polish forces contested control of the city, and the Polish-Ukrainian War, 1918 to 1919, ensued. Despite initial successes, Ukrainian forces were eventually pushed out of Galicia by mid-1919, and Poland consolidated its control after the Entente powers recognized Polish sovereignty over the region. By 1919, Ukraine was a fragmented battlefield. The Red Army controlled much of eastern and central Ukraine. White forces held southern regions for a time. Poles advanced in the west, and Makhno's anarchists dominated parts of the south with their guerrilla tactics. The Directorate government struggled to maintain authority, forced into constant retreat. Amid this chaos, civilians suffered immensely. The years 1918 to 1921 saw famine, economic collapse, and outbreaks of typhus. Pogroms were widespread. Jewish communities, accused by various factions of supporting their enemies, endured massacres at the hands of both white and Ukrainian nationalist forces, as well as anarchists and Bolsheviks. Estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 100,000 Jews were killed in these pogroms, leaving a lasting scar on Ukrainian-Jewish relations. In 1920, the tide began to shift decisively in favor of the Bolsheviks. After initial setbacks, the Red Army regrouped and reasserted control over Ukraine. The Directorate, weakened and divided, sought alliances to survive. In April 1920, Simon Petlura signed an agreement with Józef Pilsudski of Poland, recognizing Polish control over Galicia in exchange for Polish military assistance against the Bolsheviks. In May 1920, joint Polish-Ukrainian forces captured Kiev, but the Red Army counterattacked swiftly, pushing them back and advancing deep into Poland by the summer. The Polish-Soviet War culminated in the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, when Pilsudski's forces repelled the Red Army in what became known as the Miracle on the Vistula. The subsequent Treaty of Riga, signed on March 18, 1921, ended hostilities between Poland and Soviet Russia, partitioning Ukrainian lands once again. Western Ukraine, Galicia, and Volhynia went to Poland, northern Bukovina to Romania, and Transcarpathia to Czechoslovakia, while the rest was absorbed into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainian SSR, was formally established in December 1919, though its borders were finalized only after the Treaty of Riga. It became one of the founding republics of the years 1917 to 1921 were thus decisive in Ukraine's modern history. In the space of 4 years, Ukrainians declared independence multiple times, created governments with varying orientations, fought wars against Bolsheviks, Poles, whites, and anarchists, and endured foreign occupations. Ultimately, however, Ukraine's bid for sovereignty was crushed, and the land was divided between the Soviet Union and its neighbors. This failure was not due to a lack of national aspiration, but to overwhelming geopolitical pressures, the weakness of Ukrainian institutions, and the hostility of surrounding powers. Yet the experience left an enduring legacy. The memory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the West Ukrainian People's Republic, and the heroic But tragic struggles of 1917 to 1921 remained alive in national consciousness, providing a touchstone for later generations. The Ukrainian national movement had, by the early 1920s, proven its resilience, even if it had failed to secure independence. It had created symbols, institutions, and martyrs that would inspire the next phases of the struggle. From Taras Shevchenko's verses to Hrushevsky's histories, from the Central Rada to Petlura's Directorate, the 19th and early 20th centuries had brought Ukraine from cultural revival to political nationhood, albeit one crushed by greater powers. But the memory endured, waiting for another chance to reassert itself. The 1920s began with Ukraine firmly absorbed into the Soviet Union, a republic in name, but subject in reality to Moscow's control. The defeat of the Ukrainian People's Republic and the signing of the Treaty of Riga in March 1921 partitioned Ukrainian lands, with the bulk incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Bolsheviks presented their new rule as a revolutionary liberation of the peasantry and workers, but for most Ukrainians, the coming decades would bring a mixture of modernization, repression, famine, and war. It was in this crucible that modern Ukrainian identity was further shaped, and that the scars of Soviet policies would be etched deep into its national memory. In the 1920s, the Soviet regime attempted to consolidate its authority through a policy known as Korenizatsiya, or indigenization. For Ukraine, this took the form of Ukrainization, in which the Ukrainian language and culture were officially promoted. Schools taught in Ukrainian, publications flourished, and cultural institutions were supported by the state. Writers such as Mykola Khvailovy, Les Kurbas, and Mykola Kulish spearheaded a vibrant cultural renaissance. Universities expanded instruction in Ukrainian, and the language became more prominent in administration. This period seemed to promise the revival of a national culture under Soviet auspices, even as political dissent remained impossible. But this cultural flowering was short-lived. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin had consolidated power in Moscow, and his vision for the Soviet Union required greater centralization and conformity. In 1928, Stalin launched the first five-year plan, aiming to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower. Ukraine, with its fertile farmland and rapidly growing cities, was central to this vision. Grain from Ukraine was to feed the Soviet Union and provide exports to finance industrialization. To achieve this, Stalin forced collectivization upon the peasantry. In 1929, collectivization began in earnest, requiring peasants to surrender their land, livestock, and tools to collective farms, kolkhozy. Resistance was fierce. Many peasants slaughtered their animals rather than hand them over. Rebellions flared across Ukraine. Stalin's regime responded with brutal force, branding resisting peasants as kulaks, wealthy exploiters of the poor, regardless of their actual means. These kulaks were arrested, deported to Siberia, or executed. The drive for collectivization coincided with the campaign against national deviation. By 1930, the Soviet government began reversing Ukrainization, fearing that cultural autonomy was breeding nationalism. Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, and educators were arrested in droves. The executed Renaissance, as it became known, decimated Ukraine's cultural elite in the 1930s. Figures like Khvailovy took their own lives in despair, while others were shot or sent to the Gulag. The promise of the 1920s gave way to the terror of the 1930s. The most devastating blow came in 1932 to 1933 with the Holodomor, the man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. In 1932, after poor harvests and widespread resistance to collectivization, Moscow raised grain procurement quotas to impossible levels. Grain was seized from villages by brigades of communist activists, leaving peasants with nothing to eat. Armed guards prevented villagers from accessing stores or fleeing to cities in search of food. Starvation spread rapidly. By the winter of 1932 to 1933, the Ukrainian countryside was a landscape of horror. Entire villages wasted away. Eyewitnesses recalled corpses in the streets, children with bloated stomachs, and desperate families resorting to eating bark, grass, and sometimes even the flesh of the dead. The Soviet state denied the famine, even as millions perished. Estimates vary, but historians generally place the death toll in Ukraine between 3.5 and 5 million. In addition, the famine destroyed traditional village life, crushing resistance to Soviet authority. The Holodomor has since been recognized by many scholars and governments as an act of genocide, deliberately engineered to break Ukrainian nationalism and enforce loyalty to Moscow. The trauma of the famine was followed by the Great Terror. In 1937 to 1938, Stalin unleashed purges across the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, the NKVD executed tens of thousands, particularly targeting intellectuals, clergy, and anyone suspected of nationalist sentiment. Mass graves such as those at Bakhmut near Kiev testify to the scale of the repression. Ukrainian culture was now tightly controlled. Even language was pushed aside as Russian became increasingly dominant in public life. By the eve of World War II, Ukraine was a shattered society, collectivized, terrorized, and traumatized. Yet it also remained a critical part of the Soviet system. Industrial centers in the Donbas, Dnipro, and Kharkiv produced steel, coal, and armaments. The fertile farmlands, though depopulated, were key to Soviet food supplies. Ukraine was also strategically positioned on the border with Poland and Romania, a fact that would soon become decisive. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the Red Army invaded from the east on September 17, occupying eastern Poland, including western Ukrainian territories. This brought Galicia and Volhynia, long under Polish rule, into the Soviet Union. Soviet authorities quickly imposed collectivization, suppressed Polish institutions, and deported tens of thousands of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews deemed hostile. But the Nazi-Soviet alliance was short-lived. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, sending millions of German soldiers into the Soviet Union. Ukraine lay directly in their path. Within weeks, German forces captured much of western and central Ukraine. Kiev fell on September 19, 1941, after a massive encirclement battle that left more than 600,000 Soviet troops captured. Kharkiv and Odessa also fell in 1941, while German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. German occupation in Ukraine was brutal. The Nazis saw Ukraine as Lebensraum, living space for Germans, and sought to exploit its resources. The fertile farmlands were requisitioned to feed the Reich, while millions of Ukrainians were deported to Germany as forced laborers, known as Ostarbeiter. The Jewish population was targeted for annihilation. On September 29 to 30, 1941, German forces and local collaborators massacred over 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev. Similar massacres occurred across Ukraine. By war's end, approximately 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine had been murdered in what became known as the Holocaust by bullets. Ukrainians found themselves caught between two totalitarian regimes. Some initially welcomed the Germans as liberators from Soviet terror, but hopes for independence were quickly dashed as the occupiers imposed harsh rule. Ukrainian nationalists, particularly the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, split into factions. One, led by Stepan Bandera, briefly declared independence in Lviv in June 1941, but was suppressed by the Germans, and Bandera was arrested. Another faction collaborated with the Germans for a time, while others fought both Germans and Soviets. Guerrilla groups, including the Ukrainian insurgents. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, Ukraine was firmly back within the Soviet Union, but its boundaries had expanded. The Soviet Union annexed western Ukraine from Poland, including Galicia and Volhynia, and incorporated Transcarpathia from Czechoslovakia and northern Bukovina from Romania. These acquisitions gave Soviet Ukraine nearly its modern borders. The war had left Ukraine both broken and crucial. It had borne some of the heaviest losses in the Soviet Union, suffering not only the famine of the early 1930s, but also the genocidal policies of the Nazis. Its population had been decimated, its cities ruined, but its territory had expanded. Stalin and the Soviet leadership regarded Ukraine as both indispensable to the Soviet project and potentially dangerous, given its history of nationalist resistance. Post-war policies would reflect this duality, as Ukraine became both a showcase republic and a place of continuing repression. Thus, the period from the 1920s to 1945 shaped Ukraine in ways that reverberate into the present. The trauma of collectivization and the Holodomor forged an enduring memory of suffering under Moscow's rule. The Cultural Renaissance and its destruction highlighted the fragility of Ukrainian autonomy within the Soviet system. The Holocaust and wartime devastation underscored the vulnerability of Ukraine at the crossroads of empires. And the war's end left Ukraine firmly embedded in the Soviet Union, its independence once again extinguished, but its people scarred by experiences that would continue to fuel a desire for self-determination in generations to come. The aftermath of the Second World War left Ukraine in ruins, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in its existence as part of the Soviet Union. Between 1945 and the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, Ukraine remained deeply scarred by the devastation of war while simultaneously undergoing reconstruction and further integration into the Soviet system. This was a period in which the contradictions of Ukraine's status as both a showcase republic and a land of continued repression became clear. The war's destruction was immense. An estimated 700 cities and towns and more than 28,000 villages were destroyed, leaving about 10 million people homeless. The population had dropped sharply due to famine, Nazi occupation, the Holocaust, and the massive wartime death toll. Infrastructure such as railways, factories, and bridges lay in ruins. Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Odessa were shells of their former selves. Yet, even in this devastated state, Ukraine was vital to Stalin's post-war vision. Its industrial resources, fertile farmland, and strategic location meant it was central to Soviet economic recovery and military security. Reconstruction began almost immediately after the Red Army recaptured Ukrainian territory in 1943 to 1944. Soviet authorities mobilized huge resources to rebuild heavy industry in the Donbas and Dnipro regions. Coal production, steel output, and machine building were prioritized as part of the Fourth Five-Year Plan, launched in 1946. By 1950, Ukraine's industrial output had not only recovered but exceeded pre-war levels, though at great human cost. Labor conditions were brutal, housing was scarce, and wages remained low. Food shortages persisted for years, and rationing continued until 1947. That same year, Stalin ordered a currency reform that wiped out savings and caused widespread hardship. Agriculture lagged far behind industry. Collective farms had been devastated during the war, with livestock slaughtered, equipment destroyed, and fields left fallow. The Soviet regime responded by tightening control and demanding unrealistic grain procurements, even as peasants struggled to survive. This policy culminated in another famine in 1946 to 1947, triggered by drought, but made catastrophic by state requisitions. In Ukraine, hundreds of thousands died, adding to the already immense toll of the 1932 to 1933 famine. Survivors recalled lines of starving peasants outside grain stores, begging for food that had been shipped to other regions or exported. Though less well-known than the Holodomor, the famine of 1946 to 1947 deepened popular resentment and trauma. Repression was another defining feature of the late Stalinist era. The wartime experiences of Ukrainians, particularly in the western regions, had left Moscow deeply suspicious of local loyalties. After 1945, the Soviet Union annexed western Ukrainian territories from Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, incorporating them into the Ukrainian SSR. These lands, Galicia, Volhynia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, long traditions of nationalist resistance, fostered by groups like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. From 1944 until the early 1950s, Western Ukraine was engulfed in a brutal counterinsurgency war. The UPA, numbering tens of thousands at its height, carried out ambushes, assassinations, and raids against Soviet officials, police, and soldiers. They also engaged in violent ethnic cleansing, particularly against Poles during the war years, which left deep scars on Polish-Ukrainian relations. In the post-war era, however, their primary enemy was the Soviet state. The NKVD and later the MGB responded with overwhelming force, mass arrests, deportations of families to Siberia, and systematic executions. Villages suspected of aiding insurgents were burned, and entire communities were uprooted. By 1950, the UPA was largely crushed. Its leader, Roman Shukovich, was killed in a Soviet operation on March 5, 1950. Thousands of insurgents were killed in combat or executed after capture, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were deported. The suppression of the nationalist underground was ruthless, but it did not fully extinguish the memory of resistance. For decades, Soviet propaganda depicted the UPA as fascist collaborators and bandits, while local populations remembered them more ambivalently, as both perpetrators of violence and symbols of resistance to Moscow. Alongside political repression, Stalinist policies also targeted the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which had long been influential in Galicia. In 1946, at the so-called Lviv Synod, the church was officially dissolved under Soviet pressure, and its leaders declared union with the Russian Orthodox Church. In reality, this was coerced, and many priests and bishops who resisted were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Metropolitan Joseph Slipich, head of the church, was sent to the Gulag, where he spent 18 years. The liquidation of the Greek Catholic Church was part of a broader effort to Russify and Sovietize Western Ukraine, integrating it into the broader Soviet system. Despite this repression, Ukraine gained some prominence in international affairs. As one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945, Ukraine held its own seat in the General Assembly, separate from the Soviet Union. This arrangement, which also included Belarus, was designed to give the USSR additional votes in the UN. Though it provided little real independence, it gave the Ukrainian SSR a symbolic role on the global stage, reinforcing its image as a key Soviet republic. Life in post-war Ukraine was marked by contradictions. On the one hand, rapid industrialization and urban reconstruction gave many Ukrainians new opportunities in cities. Cultural life was tightly controlled but still saw the emergence of literature, film, and art celebrating Soviet achievements. On the other hand, the pervasive presence of secret police, censorship, and constant shortages created an atmosphere of fear and hardship. The purges of the 1930s were largely over, but political arrests continued, and any expression of Ukrainian nationalism or independence was ruthlessly punished. The death of Stalin on March 5, 1953, marked the end of an era. For Ukrainians, as for other peoples of the Soviet Union, it brought a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The relentless terror of his rule began to ease, though the scars of famine, war, deportations, and executions remained vivid. Millions had perished in the preceding decades, and the cultural vitality of the 1920s had been crushed. Yet Ukraine remained indispensable to the Soviet Union, both as a breadbasket and an industrial powerhouse, and it had entered the post-war era as a republic with expanded territory and growing geopolitical significance. The years from 1945 to 1953 thus represented a complex phase in Ukraine's history. Reconstruction and industrial growth stood alongside famine and repression. The suppression of nationalist movements ensured Soviet control but also planted seeds of memory that would resurface in later struggles for independence. The liquidation of the Greek Catholic Church, the brutal crushing of the UPA, and the famine of 1946 to 1947 added new layers of suffering to an already tragic 20th century. At the same time, Ukraine's elevation as a UN member and its key role in rebuilding the Soviet economy underscored its importance within the Soviet system. In sum, the late Stalinist period was one of recovery under duress. It restored Ukraine physically but left it politically and socially constrained, unable to openly express its identity or aspirations. By the death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953, ushered in a new chapter for Ukraine within the Soviet Union. For decades, Ukrainians had endured famine, mass repression, forced collectivization, and devastating war. Stalin's passing brought both relief and uncertainty, as the rigid system he created began to change under new leadership. This period, dominated by Nikita Khrushchev until his removal in 1964, became known as the era of de-Stalinization. For Ukraine, it was marked by cautious liberalization, rapid industrial development, complex cultural revival, and continued struggles with Moscow's central control. It was also the decade in which Ukraine took steps that would shape its path toward independence, most notably the return of Crimea in 1954 and the strengthening of its institutions as one of the USSR's most important republics. Khrushchev had deep personal ties to Ukraine. He had spent much of his political career in the Ukrainian Communist Party, serving as its first secretary from 1938 to 1949, and during that time had overseen industrial expansion, collectivization, and the brutal suppression of nationalist resistance in the West. His familiarity with Ukraine influenced both his policies and his understanding of its importance. When he consolidated power after Stalin's death, Ukraine became a central stage for the Soviet Union's attempts to modernize and reform. The first years after 1953 saw cautious relaxation of repression. Political prisoners, many of them Ukrainian intellectuals, nationalists, and religious figures, began to be released from the Gulag. Among them were survivors of the liquidation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which had been forcibly merged with the Russian Orthodox Church in 1946. Although the church was not restored, some of its clergy were freed, and underground religious practices continued in western Ukraine. The mass deportations that had scarred Galicia and Volhynia in the late 1940s also ceased, though thousands remained in Siberia or Kazakhstan. A turning point came in February 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, when Khrushchev delivered his secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and mass terror. This speech reverberated across Ukraine, where memories of the Holodomor famine of 1932 to 1933, the purges of the 1930s, and the deportations of the 1940s remained vivid. For the first time, Soviet citizens could cautiously discuss past crimes, though criticism of the system itself remained dangerous. In Ukraine, intellectuals, writers, and students began to test the limits of this new openness. This thaw produced what became known as the 60 Years movement, a generation of Ukrainian poets, artists, and cultural figures who sought to revive the Ukrainian language and traditions within the Soviet framework. Writers such as Lena Kostenko, Ivan Drach, and Vasyl Simonenko began to publish works that emphasized Ukrainian identity, history, and moral conscience. While still officially loyal to socialism, their works pushed against the homogenizing Russification policies that had dominated since the 19th century. The movement also intersected with a broader revival of interest in Ukrainian folklore, theater, and art. At the same time, Khrushchev oversaw significant political restructuring. In February 1954, to mark the 300th anniversary of the 1654 Pereyaslav Agreement, he transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian SSR. This move, symbolic at the time within a unitary Soviet state, would have immense geopolitical consequences decades later. Crimea, with its majority Russian-speaking population and strategic Black Sea ports such as Sevastopol, became an integral part of Ukraine's administrative territory. Economically, the 1950s and 1960s brought rapid development. Ukraine became one of the most industrialized republics of the Soviet Union. The Donbas remained a coal mining powerhouse, while Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv expanded as centers of steel, machinery, and weapons production. Ukraine's role in the Soviet space program was especially significant. The Yuzhmash plant in Dnipropetrovsk produced intercontinental ballistic missiles and later rockets that would launch satellites and cosmonauts into orbit. Khrushchev also pushed agricultural reforms, launching the Virgin Lands Campaign in 1954, which targeted and used lands in Kazakhstan and Siberia. For Ukraine, this meant some shift of resources away from its traditional role as the breadbasket of the USSR. Though collective farms remained under pressure to increase output, Khrushchev encouraged the cultivation of maize, corn, in Ukraine, sometimes with unrealistic expectations. Agricultural results were mixed, but food production improved compared to the famine years of the 1940s. The Chernobyl region, fertile and forested, became an area of agricultural experimentation during this period, long before the 1986 nuclear disaster made it infamous. Soviet authorities also expanded mechanization on collective farms and promoted chemical fertilizers. Still, the inefficiency of collectivization remained unresolved, and rural living standards lagged far behind urban areas. Millions of villagers migrated to cities during this period, fueling urban growth, but leaving the countryside depopulated. Politically, Ukraine remained tightly controlled by the Communist Party. While Khrushchev allowed more autonomy within the republics than Stalin had, true independence was impossible. The Ukrainian Communist Party was still subordinate to Moscow, and any deviation from the party line was swiftly punished. In 1957, the party leadership in Kiev supported Khrushchev during a crisis when his opponents in the Presidium tried to oust him. Ukraine's loyalty to Khrushchev ensured continued investment and political favor, though it did not translate into genuine sovereignty. One of the most significant symbolic changes occurred in 1954 with the celebration of Kiev's 1500th anniversary. The city was presented as a founding center of East Slavic civilization, with monuments and cultural projects emphasizing its shared heritage with Russia. This narrative of brotherhood between Russians and Ukrainians, institutionalized during the Khrushchev era, masked underlying tensions. Many Ukrainians resented the continued dominance of the Russian language and culture in education, media, and administration. By the late 1950s, Russian was often the language of advancement, while Ukrainian was relegated to rural and private use. Repression never fully disappeared. The KGB, reorganized from Stalin's NKVD, monitored dissent closely. While mass terror had ended, individuals who pushed too far, demanding genuine political freedom or independence, were arrested. Writers who refused to conform, such as Levko Lukyanenko, who in 1961 founded the Ukrainian Workers' and Peasants' Union advocating independence, were sentenced to long prison terms. Lukyanenko was arrested in January 1961 and sentenced to death, later commuted to 15 years in labor camps. His case highlighted the limits of the thaw. Cultural revival was tolerated only so long as it did not challenge Soviet unity. The early 1960s also brought new challenges. In 1961, the Soviet Union sent Yuri Gagarin into space, but Ukraine played a critical role in supplying the rockets and technology. At the same time, Ukraine was hit by housing shortages, environmental problems from industrialization, and growing dissatisfaction with living standards. The Soviet government responded by launching massive housing construction projects, building standardized apartment blocks, Khrushchevkas, in Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities. These provided millions of families with private apartments for the first time, though they were often cramped and poorly built. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 underscored Ukraine's role as a military-industrial hub, producing missiles and nuclear technology. Secrecy surrounded these industries, but their presence reinforced Ukraine's strategic importance. By this time, Ukraine was not only the breadbasket of the USSR, but also its military-industrial backbone. Khrushchev's final years saw his reform energy decline. His policies increasingly appeared inconsistent, ranging from radical decentralization of economic planning in 1957 to re-centralization only a few years later. Agricultural failures, international crises, and his erratic leadership style eroded confidence. By October 1964, he was removed from power by his colleagues in the Presidium, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who, when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Ukraine emerged into independence, carrying both immense potential and heavy burdens. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament had declared sovereignty, and on December 1st, a national referendum confirmed this with overwhelming support. Over 90% of voters backed independence, including a majority in every region of the country. That same month, Ukraine joined Belarus and Russia in signing the Belavisa Accords, dissolving the Soviet Union and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. By the end of the year, the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine flew over Kiev, and the world recognized a new state. Yet independence did not mean stability. The next 2 decades would be marked by economic crises, political upheavals, corruption, and a constant tug-of-war between East and West, as Ukraine struggled to define its place in Europe and the post-Soviet world. One of the first challenges for independent Ukraine was its nuclear inheritance. When the USSR collapsed, Ukraine found itself with the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, some 1,900 strategic warheads and thousands of tactical weapons. Possession of these arms raised global concerns about proliferation. After lengthy negotiations, Ukraine agreed to give them up in exchange for security guarantees. This was formalized in the Budapest Memorandum of December 5, 1994, signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The signatories pledged to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, borders, and independence. Ukraine dismantled its nuclear arsenal by 1996, transferring warheads to Russia for disarmament. At the time, this was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, though the value of those guarantees would later be questioned bitterly. Economically, the 1990s were catastrophic. The transition from a centrally planned system to a market economy brought hyperinflation, industrial collapse, and widespread poverty. Between 1991 and 1999, Ukraine's GDP contracted by more than 40%. Inflation in 1993 alone exceeded 10,000%. Factories in the Donbas, once vital to the Soviet economy, closed or scaled back, while collective farms collapsed without central support. Ordinary Ukrainians saw their savings vanish, unemployment rise, and living standards plummet. Corruption and organized crime flourished in this environment. A new class of oligarchs emerged, seizing control of privatized industries and wielding immense political influence. Politically, Ukraine's early years were dominated by Leonid Kravchuk, its first president. Elected in 1991, a former Communist Party official, Kravchuk oversaw independence and the initial post-Soviet reforms, but was widely criticized for failing to stop economic collapse. In 1994, amid growing discontent, he was defeated by Leonid Kuchma, who promised closer ties with Russia and economic recovery. Kuchma's presidency, which lasted until 2005, defined much of Ukraine's post-Soviet trajectory. Kuchma sought to balance Ukraine's foreign policy between East and West. On one hand, he signed agreements with Russia, including a 1997 treaty recognizing Ukraine's borders and sovereignty, and allowed Russia to lease naval facilities in Sevastopol for the Black Sea Fleet. On the other hand, he pursued integration with the West, securing membership in the Council of Europe in 1995 and deepening cooperation with NATO through the Partnership for Peace program. This balancing act reflected Ukraine's internal divisions. The Western regions favored integration with Europe, while the East and South leaned toward Russia. Throughout the late 1990s, Ukraine made halting progress toward a market economy, but corruption and oligarchic control remained entrenched. High-profile scandals eroded trust in the government. The most infamous was the cassette scandal of 2000, when secret recordings implicated Kuchma in the abduction and murder of journalist Georgy Gongadze, a critic of corruption. The revelations sparked protests known as Ukraine Without Kuchma, which foreshadowed the mass movements to come. The early 2000s brought intensified geopolitical. Throughout 2021, diplomatic channels tried to reduce tensions, but Moscow's rhetoric grew sharper. Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, accused the West of dragging Ukraine into NATO's orbit and claimed Kiev was preparing an assault on the Donbas. In July 2021, Vladimir Putin published a lengthy essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians," in which he denied Ukraine's legitimacy as a nation and suggested that Ukrainian statehood was an artificial product of Soviet policies. This essay offered a glimpse into the ideological foundation for what was to come. Putin's belief that Ukraine belonged within Russia's sphere of influence and had no right to chart an independent Western path. By late autumn 2021, U.S. intelligence began warning allies of a potential Russian invasion. Satellite imagery showed growing concentrations of Russian troops, armor, and artillery near Ukraine's borders, including in Belarus. In November 2021, the Kremlin issued demands to the United States and NATO, insisting on written guarantees that NATO would never admit Ukraine and that Western forces would withdraw to positions held before 1997. These demands were rejected by Washington and its allies, who argued that sovereign nations have the right to choose their alliances. Diplomatic efforts intensified in January and February 2022. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Russian officials, while French President Emmanuel Macron shuttled between Moscow and Kiev in a bid to avert war. Germany's new Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, also joined the efforts. Yet despite these talks, Russia continued its military buildup, eventually positioning more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders by mid-February. Western intelligence made the unusual step of publicly warning that a full-scale invasion was imminent. Some world leaders remained skeptical, recalling earlier Russian pressure tactics, but the scale of the deployment suggested something more serious. On February 21, 2022, Vladimir Putin delivered a televised address in which he recognized the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. This move tore up the Minsk agreements and set the stage for war. Putin's speech was laced with historical grievances, accusing Ukraine of being a failed state and blaming the West for expanding NATO. That same day, Russian forces began moving openly into Donbas under the guise of peacekeeping. 3 days later, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. Within minutes, missile strikes hit Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other major cities, while Russian ground forces advanced from the north through Belarus, from the east across Donbas, and from the south via Crimea. Putin claimed that the objectives were to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, phrases that carried no basis in reality but served as propaganda to justify the attack. The invasion marked the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. In the first days, Russian troops made rapid advances, seizing large swathes of territory in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Sumy regions. They pushed to within 20 kilometers of Kiev, raising fears the capital could fall. Yet Ukrainian resistance proved far stronger than Moscow anticipated. President Zelensky refused offers to be evacuated, declaring in a video on February 25th, "I need ammunition, not a ride." This defiant stance galvanized Ukrainians and drew admiration worldwide. Ordinary citizens took up arms, built barricades, and joined territorial defense units. The West responded with unprecedented unity. On February 26th, the European Union imposed sweeping sanctions on Russian banks, oligarchs, and technology imports. Germany reversed decades of policy by halting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and pledging to increase military spending. The United States and its allies froze Russia's foreign reserves, crippling its central bank. Within weeks, over 1,000 foreign companies suspended or ended operations in Russia. NATO countries began supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry, including anti-tank systems, drones, and air defense missiles. By March 2022, the Russian offensive stalled around Kiev. Supply lines stretched thin, morale faltered, and Ukrainian counterattacks inflicted heavy losses. On April 2nd, Ukrainian forces retook Bucha, a town northwest of Kiev, where they discovered mass graves and evidence of atrocities committed by Russian soldiers. The Bucha massacre shocked the world, reinforcing Western resolve to support Ukraine. In early April, Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine entirely, abandoning its effort to capture Kiev. Having failed in its initial objective, Russia refocused on eastern Ukraine. By late April 2022, the Battle of Donbas began, with intense fighting in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and surrounding towns. Meanwhile, in the south, Mariupol endured a brutal siege lasting from early March until May 20th, when the last Ukrainian defenders in the Azovstal steel plant surrendered after weeks of bombardment. Mariupol was left in ruins, with tens of thousands of civilians killed. By the summer of 2022, the war had become a grinding struggle. Ukraine, bolstered by Western aid, launched successful counteroffensives in the Kharkiv region in September and recaptured the city of Kherson in November. Russia, unable to achieve a quick victory, resorted to missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, plunging cities into darkness during the winter. The conflict became a war of attrition, with global repercussions for food supplies, energy markets, and geopolitical alignments. This escalation, from Zelensky's election in 2019 through the full-scale invasion in 2022, marked a turning point not only in Russian-Ukrainian relations, but also in the post-Cold War international order. For the first time since 1945, a nuclear-armed power had launched a full invasion of a European neighbor, challenging the very foundations of sovereignty and security on the continent. The roots of this war lay deep in centuries of contested identity, imperial legacies, and geopolitical rivalry. But its eruption in 2022 was also a product of choices made in recent years, choices that reshaped the world. The morning of February 24th, 2022, marked a rupture not only in the lives of millions of Ukrainians, but also in the order of the world that had been built since the end of the Cold War. After months of escalating tensions, military buildups, and diplomatic warnings, Russia launched what it called a special military operation. It was, in fact, a full-scale invasion, an attempt to conquer a sovereign nation by force. At dawn, missiles struck Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Mariupol, and dozens of other Ukrainian cities. Tanks and infantry rolled across the northern border from Belarus, across the eastern front from Russia, and from the south through the already occupied Crimea. Vladimir Putin, who only 3 days earlier had delivered a speech denying the legitimacy of Ukraine as a nation, now sought to prove his words with steel and fire. In the first days, Russia's plan was ambitious: a lightning strike on Kiev, the capture or assassination of Ukraine's government, and the swift imposition of a pro-Russian regime. Paratroopers landed near Hostomel Airport outside Kiev on February 24th, aiming to establish an air bridge for reinforcements. Russian convoys, stretching for miles, advanced through Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts. Yet resistance was fierce. Ukrainian soldiers, bolstered by territorial defense volunteers and armed civilians, fought in the streets. Anti-tank weapons supplied by the West, such as American javelins and British NLAWs, stopped Russian armor columns. By the end of March, the Russian army, unable to break through to the capital, was forced into retreat from northern Ukraine. The battles of Mariupol and Kharkiv told different stories of devastation. Mariupol, a port city on the Sea of Azov, became encircled by early March. Cut off from supplies, its residents endured bombardment without food, water, or electricity. On March 9, 2022, a Russian airstrike hit a maternity hospital, shocking the world. By May, Ukrainian defenders, including the Azov Regiment and Marines, retreated into the underground bunkers of the Azovstal steel plant. For weeks, they held out against overwhelming Russian firepower until surrendering on May 20th. The siege left tens of thousands of civilians dead and the city in ruins. In Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, shelling reduced entire districts to rubble. But unlike Mariupol, Kharkiv held firm, with its defenders pushing Russian forces back toward the border. In April, revelations from towns liberated near Kiev stunned the world. In Bucha, Irpin, and Borodyanka, investigators discovered mass graves and streets littered with bodies, many showing signs of execution. These atrocities were documented by journalists and confirmed by human rights groups, becoming symbols of the brutality of the Russian occupation. Western nations responded with a wave of sanctions targeting Russian banks, businesses, and elites. The European Union began to wean itself off Russian energy, while the United States and its allies poured billions of dollars of military aid into Ukraine. The HIMARS rocket artillery system, first delivered in summer 2022, allowed Ukraine to strike deep behind Russian lines, changing the dynamics of the war. By late spring, Russia shifted its strategy. Abandoning the failed push on Kiev, Moscow concentrated its forces in the east and south. Its goal was the conquest of the Donbas, the industrial heartland comprising Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in May and June were brutal, with Russia using overwhelming artillery to grind down Ukrainian positions. On July 3, 2022, Russia declared it had taken all of Luhansk Oblast. Yet this advance came at staggering cost, with Russian forces suffering tens of thousands of casualties. Ukraine, meanwhile, prepared for a counterattack. Throughout the summer, Ukrainian officials spoke of liberating Kherson, the only regional capital captured by Russia since the invasion began. In late August, the counteroffensive began. Using Western-supplied weapons, Ukraine targeted bridges across the Dnipro River, cutting off Russian supply lines. At the same time, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive in the Kharkiv region. In September 2022, Ukrainian forces recaptured Izium, Kupiansk, and Balaklia, routing Russian troops and liberating thousands of square kilometers in days. The lightning success shocked Moscow and galvanized Kiev supporters. On September 30th, 2022, Vladimir Putin held a ceremony in the Kremlin to declare the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The move was widely condemned as illegal, as Russia did not even fully control these territories. In response, Ukraine formally applied for NATO membership. The war, initially seen as a regional conflict, had now locked Russia into confrontation with the entire Western alliance. By November, Ukrainian troops completed the liberation of Kherson City, forcing Russian forces to withdraw to the eastern bank of the Dnipro. The retreat marked another humiliating defeat for Moscow, though Russia responded with a new campaign of missile and drone strikes. From October 2022 onward, waves of Iranian-supplied Shahid drones and cruise missiles targeted Ukraine's energy grid. Cities were plunged into darkness, heating systems failed, and millions faced winter without electricity. Yet Ukrainian engineers worked tirelessly to repair the grid, and Western aid delivered generators and air defenses such as NASAMS and IRIS-T. The war became a test of endurance. By the end of 2022, Russia had mobilized hundreds of thousands of new conscripts following Putin's partial mobilization decree of September 21st. These men, often poorly trained and equipped, were thrown into battlefields such as Bakhmut, where fighting turned into a gruesome war of attrition. The Wagner mercenary group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, spearheaded the assault. Bakhmut, a small city of limited strategic value, became symbolic. Both sides poured in resources, with Russia seeking a rare victory and Ukraine determined to bleed its enemy. Meanwhile, the diplomatic front widened. On May 18, 2022, Finland and Sweden formally applied to join NATO, abandoning decades of neutrality in response to Russia's aggression. The European Union granted Ukraine candidate status in June, marking a historic step in Kiev's westward integration. The United Nations estimated that by December 2022, more than 7 million Ukrainians had fled abroad as refugees, while millions more were internally displaced. The war reshaped global politics. Food shortages spread as Russian blockades halted Ukrainian grain exports, only partially alleviated by a UN-brokered deal in July, allowing limited shipments through the Black Sea. By the close of 2022, the lines of battle had hardened. Russia controlled nearly 20% of Ukraine's territory, but its initial ambitions of toppling Kiev and subjugating the nation had failed. Ukraine, bloodied but unbroken, had reclaimed large swathes of land and proven its resilience. Western aid continued to flow, though questions about the war's duration and cost grew louder. For Russia, the war had become a quagmire, with tens of thousands of soldiers lost, its economy under strain, and its global isolation deepening. For Ukraine, it was a fight for survival, identity, and independence, a struggle echoing through centuries of history where its sovereignty had so often been denied. As 2022 ended, the war showed no sign of conclusion. The world had witnessed atrocities, resistance, and shifting tides of battle, but the larger questions remained unanswered. Would Ukraine succeed in restoring its territorial integrity? Could Russia sustain a war that had already cost it so dearly? And what would be the long-term consequences for Europe and the global order? The events of that year, from the shock of February to the triumphs of Kharkiv and Kherson, had already ensured that the Russia-Ukraine war would be remembered as one of the defining conflicts of the 21st century, reshaping borders, alliances, and the meaning of sovereignty in our time. The opening months of 2023 saw the Russia-Ukraine war enter a new and bitterly entrenched phase. The sweeping maneuvers of the first year, the lightning advances and retreats, gave way to grinding battles of attrition. Both armies dug in across a front line stretching more than 1,000 kilometers, from the edges of Kherson in the south to the forests and towns of the Donbas in the east. The city of Bakhmut became the war's focal point, a place whose name, though obscure before, came to symbolize the sheer ferocity of the struggle. Beginning in late 2022 and intensifying through the winter, Russian forces, spearheaded by the Wagner private military company under Yevgeny Prigozhin, launched relentless assaults on the city. Day after day, Ukrainian defenders clung to ruined streets and blasted trenches, while Russian troops, often composed of convicts recruited by Wagner, advanced in costly waves. By May 20th, 2023, after months of horrific losses on both sides, Russian forces claimed control of Bakhmut, though at immense cost. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war, with estimates of tens of thousands killed or wounded, and left the city a shell of its former self. Throughout 2023, Ukraine prepared for a major counteroffensive. The winter had been spent training new brigades equipped with Western-supplied tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery. Leopard 2 tanks from Germany, Challenger 2s from Britain, and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles from the United States arrived on Ukrainian soil. Kyiv hoped to replicate the stunning successes of Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022, breaking through Russian lines and liberating occupied territory. In June 2023, Ukraine launched its long-awaited counteroffensive along several axes in Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts. The objective was to reach the Sea of Azov and cut off the Russian land corridor to Crimea. Yet the offensive faced formidable obstacles. Russia had spent months constructing elaborate defensive fortifications, including minefields, dragon's teeth barriers, trenches, and bunkers. These defenses, stretching for kilometers, slowed Ukrainian progress to a crawl. Despite heavy losses, Ukraine made incremental gains, capturing villages such as Robotyne by August 2023. The fighting demonstrated the difficulty of breaking entrenched positions in modern warfare. Still, Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian-occupied Crimea showcased Kyiv's ability to adapt. Drone and missile attacks hit the Kerch Strait Bridge, the vital link between Russia and Crimea, in July 2023 and again in October, disrupting Moscow's supply lines. Ukrainian special forces also struck Russian air bases, destroying aircraft and challenging Russia's sense of security in the peninsula. Russia responded by intensifying missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, particularly targeting its energy infrastructure once more as the winter of 2023-24 approached. Waves of Iranian-made Shahid drones and cruise missiles descended on Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv. Yet Ukraine's air defenses, strengthened by systems such as the American Patriot missile batteries, grew increasingly capable. By late 2023, Kyiv could intercept a majority of incoming missiles, though the barrages continued to cause civilian casualties and damage. The winter became another test of endurance for the Ukrainian people, who had already withstood more than a year and a half of war. On the political front, Ukraine's ties with the West deepened. In July 2023, at the NATO summit in Vilnius, leaders reaffirmed their support for Ukraine, though Kyiv's hopes for immediate membership were deferred. Instead, NATO promised a pathway to eventual membership and long-term security guarantees. Western aid continued to flow, with the United States passing multi-billion-dollar military assistance packages and European nations pledging further support. At the same time, questions about the sustainability of aid began to emerge in Western capitals, where economic pressures and political divisions grew more visible. Russia, for its part, sought support from countries outside the Western Bloc, tightening its military partnership with Iran and deepening economic ties with China. The war also entered the realm of internal Russian politics. In June 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin led a shocking mutiny, marching Wagner forces toward Moscow after accusing the Russian Defense Ministry of corruption and incompetence. Though the rebellion was halted short of the capital after negotiations, it exposed fissures within the Russian state and revealed the fragility of Putin's grip. Prigozhin's death in a plane crash on August 23, 2023, widely suspected to be orchestrated by the Kremlin, eliminated a potential rival but also underscored the atmosphere of intrigue and instability within Russia's ruling elite. By the end of 2023, Ukraine had liberated some territory in Zaporizhia but had fallen short of a decisive breakthrough. Russia still controlled nearly a fifth of Ukraine, including Crimea, much of the Donbas, and large parts of the southern front. The war settled into a deadly stalemate, though one punctuated by constant strikes, sabotage, and drone warfare. Both sides raced to innovate, with Ukraine pioneering the use of naval drones to attack Russian ships in the Black Sea. In September 2023, Ukraine damaged Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, demonstrating that even in heavily fortified Crimea, Russia was vulnerable. The year 2024 opened with no clear path to peace. Russia, having weathered sanctions and absorbed heavy losses, continued to mobilize men and resources, framing the war as an existential battle against the West. Ukraine, determined to liberate its land, pressed for more advanced weapons, including F-16 fighter jets, promised by several NATO allies in mid-2023, with training programs underway. Western leaders, though cautious about escalation, maintained their support, recognizing that a Ukrainian defeat would have profound consequences for European security. By early 2024, the war's global repercussions had become unmistakable. Energy markets had shifted dramatically, with Europe largely ending its dependence on Russian gas. Grain exports from Ukraine, disrupted by Russian blockades, continued to affect food prices worldwide, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. The war reshaped military doctrines, with drones, electronic warfare, and artillery proving decisive. Nations across the world studied the conflict for lessons about the future of warfare. On the ground, the fighting remained intense. In Avdiivka, near Donetsk, Russia launched a new offensive in October 2023 that extended into 2024, seeking to encircle Ukrainian defenders. The battle mirrored the earlier carnage of Bakhmut, with relentless shelling and high casualties. Meanwhile, Ukraine continued to target Russian logistics in Crimea and deep within Russian territory, carrying out drone strikes on Moscow itself by mid-2023 and expanding them in 2024. By mid-2024, it was clear that neither side was capable of delivering a knockout blow. International calls for negotiations grew louder, though Kiev insisted it would not cede territory and Moscow refused to abandon its annexation claims. The war became one of attrition not only on the battlefield but also in diplomacy, economics, and global influence. As 2025 unfolded, the front lines remained contested. Ukrainian forces sought incremental gains in Zaporizhia and Donetsk, while Russia entrenched further, betting that Western resolve might falter over time. The war entered its third year with no resolution in sight. For Ukraine, it remained a struggle for national survival, for sovereignty, and for the right to chart its own future. For Russia, it was framed as a confrontation with NATO and the West, a justification for authoritarian consolidation at home. The Russia-Ukraine war, once thought in February 2022 to be a swift campaign, had by 2025 become a protracted struggle reshaping the 21st century. It redrew alliances, altered global economics, and redefined the meaning of resilience in modern warfare. Its outcome remained uncertain, but its place in history was already secure. A war born of centuries of contested borders and imperial ambition, yet fought in the age of drones, satellites, and instant global communication. Each month brought new battles, new tragedies, and new acts of defiance, as the fate of Ukraine and the balance of Europe hung in the balance. History, when viewed not as a list of dates, but as a river, shows us how events carry forward their sediments of memory, power, and trauma. The story of Russia and Ukraine is not simply one of two nations in conflict. It is a drama of civilizations, empires, and peoples whose destinies have overlapped, intertwined, and clashed over the span of 1,000 years. To understand the present war, one must see the echoes of Kievan Rus, the scars of Mongol invasion, the rise of Muscovy, the long centuries of Polish-Lithuanian and Russian domination, and the heavy hand of Soviet rule. All these layers converge on the present battlefield, where soldiers dig trenches in the black earth of Ukraine, the same soil that has borne the weight of conquest, famine, and resistance across the centuries. The closing years of the 20th century were supposed to bring clarity. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed, at least to Western eyes, to have resolved the question of empire. 15 new states emerged from Moscow's shadow, each claiming sovereignty. Ukraine, the second most populous of the former republics, declared independence on August 24, 1991, and confirmed it in a December referendum where more than 90% of voters supported the step. For the first time since the brief experiment of 1917 to 1921, Ukraine stood as an independent state. Many hoped that the turbulence of empire had ended, that the future would now unfold in peace. Yet the legacy of centuries would not allow the transition to be so simple. At the heart of the conflict lies a clash not only of geopolitics, but of identity. Russian leaders, from Vladimir Putin backwards through the centuries, have often asserted that Ukraine is not truly separate, that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Putin himself wrote in July 2021 that Ukraine's statehood was an anti-Russian project. Such arguments draw on a selective reading of history, claiming continuity between Kievan Rus and modern Russia, while overlooking Ukraine's own distinct linguistic, cultural, and political traditions. But history resists simplification. Kievan Rus was a federation of principalities, with Kiev at its center. It fragmented long before Moscow rose to prominence. Ukrainian identity developed through exposure to Polish, Lithuanian, and Austro-Hungarian influences, alongside Orthodoxy and Cossack traditions. To deny Ukraine's separate path is to flatten the complexities of a millennium into an imperial narrative. The traumas of the 20th century left deep fissures. The Holodomor famine of 1932 to 1933, orchestrated by Stalin's policies, killed millions of Ukrainians, and remains one of the most contested and painful episodes in their history. During the Second World War, the German invasion brought mass destruction, the murder of over 1 million Jews in Ukraine, and fierce battles on its soil. The war also left lingering divisions. Some Ukrainians fought in the Red Army, while others joined nationalist groups that opposed both Soviet and German domination. After the war, Soviet authority reasserted itself, and Ukraine became an industrial heartland of the USSR. But beneath the surface, memories of repression and aspirations for autonomy endured. When independence came in 1991, it was not just a legal declaration. It was a release of long-suppressed desires for self-determination. Yet independence did not resolve the tension between East and West, between the Russian-speaking regions and the Ukrainian-speaking ones, between those looking toward Moscow and those aspiring toward Europe. This divide became sharper in the 2000s. The Orange Revolution of 2004 demonstrated a mass rejection of electoral fraud and a demand for a European-oriented democracy. The Euromaidan protests of 2013 to 2014, sparked by President Yanukovych's refusal to sign an association agreement with the European Union, revealed how strong the desire for integration with Europe had become. The government's violent crackdown only fueled the protests, culminating in Yanukovych's flight in February 2014. It was this turning point that prompted Russia's seizure of Crimea and the covert arming of separatists in the Donbas. For Moscow, Ukraine's westward drift threatened not only its geopolitical influence, but its vision of history itself, the idea that Ukraine belonged inseparably to the Russian world. The war that began in 2014 has already shattered illusions of stability. Crimea's annexation violated international law and redrew borders in Europe by force for the first time since 1945. The Donbas conflict created a frozen war that cost over 14,000 lives between 2014 and 2021. Yet even then, many believed the conflict could be contained, that diplomacy might prevail. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 promised a roadmap to peace, though their provisions were contested and never fully implemented. Behind the fragile lines, however, Russia was preparing for something larger. Western intelligence later revealed that Moscow had been modernizing its military, pre-positioning logistics, and softening the international stage with disinformation campaigns long before tanks rolled across the border in February 2022. The invasion of February 24, 2022, marked a rupture. It was not merely another stage in a regional conflict, but the beginning of the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. Russian forces struck Kiev, Kharkiv, and cities across Ukraine. Many analysts predicted a swift collapse of Ukrainian defenses. Instead, the Ukrainian people, led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, rallied in defiance. In the early days, images of civilians confronting tanks, women making Molotov cocktails, and Zelensky refusing evacuation offers circulated the world. Kiev held, Kharkiv resisted, Mariupol endured a brutal siege. Russia's gamble that Ukraine would fold quickly had failed. The war settled into a grinding struggle, marked by immense destruction, shifting front lines, and atrocities documented in places like Bucha and Irpin. As the war dragged on through 2022 and 2023, its wider implications became clear. For Europe, the war forced a reckoning with energy dependence on Russia, leading to sanctions and a reconfiguration of global energy flows. For NATO, it spurred expansion, with Finland joining in 2023 and Sweden's bid advancing. For the global south, the war disrupted grain supplies, reminding the world of Ukraine's role as a breadbasket. And for Russia, the invasion hardened isolation, deepened reliance on China, and sparked internal dissent, seen most dramatically in the Wagner Group's mutiny in June 2023. Yet despite sanctions, isolation, and heavy casualties, Moscow persisted, framing the war as an existential struggle against the West. By 2024 and 2025, the war had reached a bloody stalemate. Ukrainian counteroffensives liberated Kherson and made gains in the east, but Russia entrenched itself with fortified lines. Both sides adapted, Ukraine with Western-supplied weapons, drones, and intelligence support, Russia with mass mobilization and industrial ramp-up of arms production. The human cost mounted, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and millions displaced. The war became not just a contest of armies, but of endurance, whose society could bear the strain longer, whose allies would remain committed, whose will would break first. In the end, the war may be remembered not only for its battles, but for what it represents. It is a war over the meaning of sovereignty in the 21st century. It is a war over whether borders can be changed by force, whether smaller nations can choose their alignments, and whether the tragedies of the 20th century will be repeated or overcome. It is also a war about memory, about whose version of history prevails, about whether Ukraine's story is its own or subsumed into Russia's imperial narrative. The echoes of the past, the Cossack rebellions, the Holodomor, the partisans of the Second World War, and the protests of Maidan all reverberate in the choices Ukrainians make today. What we are witnessing is not just the struggle of one nation against another, but the unfolding of a civilizational fault line. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the partitions of Poland, the upheavals of the world wars, and the collapse of empires all remind us that Eastern Europe has long been a crossroads where great powers contend and small nations fight for survival. Ukraine's war is part of this longer pattern, but it is also unique. Never before has Ukraine had such international support. Never before has its identity been so consolidated. Never has the idea of an independent Ukraine been so firmly rooted in the consciousness of its people. As this war continues into an uncertain future, one truth is clear. Ukraine will never again be seen as a borderland, a periphery, or merely a prize in someone else's empire. Whatever its borders may look like when the guns fall silent, Ukraine has already secured its place as a sovereign actor in world history. Its resilience has rewritten assumptions about power and endurance. Its struggle has exposed the fragility of empires built on coercion. And its story reminds us that history is not an abstract force, but the lived experience of millions who plant crops under shellfire, who sing folk songs in bomb shelters, who carry forward the memory of ancestors who endured worse and survived. The history of the Russia-Ukraine war is thus not finished. It is being written daily, in trenches, in diplomatic halls, in ruined cities, and in the hearts of those who endure. To reflect on it now is to stand midstream, watching the river of history surge forward. What lies ahead we cannot yet say, but we can be certain that centuries from now, when future generations look back, they will not see Ukraine as a mere battleground in someone else's story. They will see it as a nation that asserted its right to exist, and in doing so, changed the course of Europe's history.